All right. Thank you, Caitlin, for coming on the show today. I really appreciate you taking the time. You are the founder and CEO of Custodia Bank, and you've been in Bitcoin since 2012, just kind of interested in doing relevant things in the space. And before that, you spent over a couple of decades in traditional finance, working for Morgan Stanley as well as a couple other firms. So great to have you on the podcast today, and looking forward to digging into a bunch of this stuff. But before we get started, I think the best place to start would be if you could just kind of tell your story for those who don't know you, from as early as you're willing to start to where you are today, and maybe talking about some of the decisions you made along the way.
Yeah, thanks. Born and raised in Wyoming. Went to law school, self-educated in finance for the most part. Do have a master's in public policy as well. And then went to Wall Street to pay off my debt, school debt, and stayed there a lot longer than I anticipated. Came across Bitcoin in 2012. It was as a result of me taking a very deep and broad dive into alternative schools of economic thought, which have bubbled up in a big debate over Twitter this past weekend. We got more, TradFi folks coming in and curious, and a lot of a lot of folks have gone to their respective corners, and I lament that. And just start slinging mud at each other. I lament that because I think there are a lot of curious people watching and trying to learn. And as somebody who came from TradFi, and I understood the significance of Bitcoin through a couple of different lenses. It was through the Austrian school lens. That was one of the schools that I did a deep and broad dive on after the 2008 financial crisis. But then also the just kind of folks who are already in like that modern monetary theory or chartalist camp. They're never ever going to get Bitcoin because to them money is only what the government says it is. But to the rest who are curious or who weren't sort of dogmatic, maybe they took one or two economics classes in high school or college, and they know something's new and different. They sense that something has is wrong in the financial system, and they can't quite put their finger on it. That's the group that I hope to be able to bring more curious people in, because in my early days, I, just like everybody, was skeptical of Bitcoin in the beginning. And yet, once you have the aha, my experience is that pretty much nobody after going down that rabbit hole comes back out.
Yeah, a couple of interesting things there that I'd love to like sort of zoom in on. When you first came across Bitcoin, everyone's got like sort of their own story. Yours is not a super uncommon one, but it's obviously uncommonly early and through this particular track where a lot of people who got there uncommonly early went through this track, which is sort of like the Austrian school track that sort of led people to Bitcoin back then. So can you sort of rewind back to that point in time where here you are, several years into your career in traditional finance, or you've been calling TradFi, for those who aren't, familiar with the lingo, and you sort of stumble upon like, okay, here's this interesting school of thought, and
Yeah.
here's this thing, Bitcoin, that people are talking about here. Like, what led you down that rabbit hole of different things in the first place? You mentioned you sort of got into it maybe after 2008, so maybe you had that first sense of like, okay, something's actually really broken here. Can you just
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that moment?
Yeah, and it is important to say I didn't completely get there through the Austrian school. That was where I started seeing references to it in 2012. But it was also because I was doing on my Wall Street career, I started a market for large value pension transfers. And the first transaction happened in 2012 at that exact same time that I came across Bitcoin. And I was dealing with the operational morass of the financial system, and it has not really gotten better since 2012. And I'll go into that in greater detail. But so it really was two lenses that caused me to have aha moments. But backing up, what caused me to go on this intellectual journey of looking at alternative schools of economic thought? I realized that what I'd learned in economics class wasn't really the way the world worked. And I had, classic Keynesian type economics. I took quite a bit of economics. My undergrad degree is political economy, which was basically a joint degree between political science and economics. And then my graduate degree was at the Kennedy School, and I specialized in international trade and finance. And then once I figured out I was going to go to Wall Street, I was better at numbers than words. While I was in law school, I started taking elective classes. We didn't have like MOOCs or, free online classes back then. So I registered for the Harvard Extension School and started taking finance classes and accounting classes, cross-registered to Harvard Business School and took a couple of finance classes, just dove into the deep end of the pool because I'd never had a basic finance class. But I had economics. So long story short, I had just the classic, 30 years ago, both micro and macro economics, and then did take some history of economic thought. But what was so interesting is that the schools of thought that I studied in my own journey after 2008 were not part of my economic history class. They were considered fringe on both the left and the right. Meaning, that's probably a bad dichotomy. They were just considered fringe. The Austrian school is kind of the extreme free market school of thought, and then the chartalists, which has now been reincarnated as modern monetary theory, are basically there shouldn't ever be private banks, and government should be exclusively in charge of money, and money is what the government says it is. There is no such thing as private money. The biggest difference between those schools of thought on the range, and I did look into others in between as well. The biggest difference, and the reason why I ultimately gravitated more towards the Austrian school, but not exclusively there, it is because the modern monetary theory school of thought doesn't have a capital structure. Essentially, it says that there's an infinite balance sheet. And the reason why I ended up mostly towards the Austrian school, although with big caveats, is because, of course, the balance sheet matters. And this is, to put it into perspective of today's school, some of the phrases that people throw around, deficits don't matter. Okay, that is sort of the, new Keynesian and modern monetary theory, which is really in control of economic policy right now, that literally deficits don't matter. We shouldn't have a debt ceiling. We owe it to ourselves. Paul Krugman, a lot of his writings, and the folks in the Biden administration who control economic policy, and increasingly the people who have been appointed to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, come from those schools of thought. And it essentially is that we shouldn't have anything other than postal banking. They don't like private banks generally. They would rather have one single public bank and a central bank digital currency that they control. So it's an extreme government control. It really is the polar opposite of the Austrian school, which is no government. Now, the biggest critique I always like to say that I landed with the Austrian school was that they're always sort of claiming hyperinflation is around the corner. And to me, the biggest interesting question is, why didn't that happen, right? They started screaming about it after the US left the gold standard in 1971, and the dollar didn't collapse. Why? That's the most important question to ask yourself. Why? So the Austrian school, as has been published in scholarship, is not where I am. But I do believe that their approach, which is the Austrian theory of the business cycle, I've observed it so many times, and I think that's the best way to explain what's wrong, and essentially, to put it into layman's terms, the conclusion is that the one price that should absolutely never be government controlled is the price of borrowing money. In other words, the interest rate. And yet that is the price that is the most government controlled, right? We have the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, those 7 governors, unelected, who are, supposedly economics experts, who are setting interest rates. That is the antithesis of a free market. And why is it so important that one price be the one that is not controlled? The answer is that is the stoplight. It is the mechanism through which capital allocators allocate capital across industries and across time. And if your interest rate signals are screwed up, you're going to be making the wrong decisions. And coming back full circle to your question about 2008, it was recognizing that, why is it that everybody overinvested in land in 2008? They all made the same mistake in the same direction. And that wouldn't have happened in a free market. There was an incentive created through interest rates being too cheap. And what tends to happen is when interest rates are artificially cheap relative to what they would be in a free market, you get overinvestment in long-term projects. And land is, of course, real estate development is one of the longest term industries. And so you got overinvestment in the housing market and in real estate. And lo and behold, massive defaults from subprime. So there was another piece in 2008 that also got me going, which is I was watching Tim Geithner, the then Treasury Secretary under Obama, explain that the Fed had held interest rates too low in 2008, and that is what created the mortgage meltdown. And then a week or two later, he made a speech where he was urging the Fed to reduce interest rates even lower. And that was just a clear contradiction to me, which one was true. And the answer, I dug in, and it was his first statement was true. But again, this is evidence of the fact that we don't live in a free market economy. We live in a managed economy, and it is managed for GDP growth to be relatively stable. And it's out there for everybody to see. It's the Fed's mandates of full employment and price stability. And I think there's a third unwritten one, which is financial system stability as well. And, boy, once you go down that intellectual journey of looking at the different schools of economic thought, boy, do you open up your eyes.
Right. So, I mean, that's a super informative perspective, and I appreciate you sharing it. I think the question for me then becomes, okay, so the current system seems broken, and there seems to be a better way of doing things, something along the lines of the Austrian school, but perhaps something slightly different. You mentioned having your caveats, namely, I think hyperinflation not always being around the corner, and perhaps some other
Right.
things. But what is the status of the system? Obviously, we had the banking crisis several months ago. 2008, only whatever, 15, 16 years behind us at this point. Not a long time in the scheme of things in the long term. And so we're seeing sort of like these cracks, and
Yeah.
some could argue that, hey, this is just a natural part of what happens. And look, the banking crisis, people thought that we were going to have this landslide of banks going down, and it actually kind of stopped due to these measures that were
Yeah.
instituted. But it's like, well, are we just sort of putting tape on the leak in the bucket, and eventually it's all going to sort of like blow up? But basically, what's your sort of evaluation of the current status of the current system, and is there a way to move to a new system that doesn't sort of involve catastrophe along the way?
Well, of course there is, and that's what I'm interested in, right? If I actually thought that the financial system was going to implode tomorrow, why would I have started a traditional bank to deal with U.S. dollars if I thought the U.S. dollar was going to go away tomorrow? A lot of people in the crypto industry overstate that case, and I think we don't do ourselves justice when we are sounding so extreme. And that's why I lament, there was this big back and forth between TradFi folks and Bitcoiners over the weekend. And I exited, as did Lynn Alden, I exited the thread when the TradFi folks started throwing ad hominems at us, that we were not educated, that we were criminals, that we were charlatans, right? The moment you start throwing ad hominems, you're not going to reach any common ground. But I thought it was really an interesting experiment in getting at the fault lines. Why is it that those folks in that TradFi world can't see where the Bitcoiners see things clearly? And I came down to three differences of opinion. One is that an asset must have intrinsic value for it to be valuable, versus the Bitcoiners who say all value is subjective. So that whole kind of intrinsic versus subjective value is number one. Number two is, what is the definition of inflation? They would say it's CPI or PPI, those kind of measures. And the Bitcoiners would say, no, inflation is an increase in the money supply, and the CPI and PPI are effects of inflation, not the inflation itself. And then the third is, what is the definition of money? That's the basic one. I have found this the most interesting observation in my whole journey, is that money itself is the most confusing topic, and the people who work most closely to it, in other words, people who work in money factories like banks and broker dealers and asset managers every day, are the ones who tend to misunderstand it the most. ironically. And the distinction is, again, as I said in the beginning, um, that it was revealed that this TradFi group thought money is what the government says it is, and the Bitcoiners think money can spontaneously arise as a good that is commonly accepted in exchange as a medium of exchange. And I think history on those three things, right? Intrinsic versus subjective value, inflation. What is the definition of inflation, and what is the definition of money? Those three things are the fault lines. And I happen to come down on the Bitcoiner side on all three of those. I do believe that all value is subjective. Real estate's a perfect example of that. You rent your house out and you get upset that it doesn't get the same rent as your neighbor who rented their house out. Why? Because all value is subjective. There is no such thing as an objective rent. And then inflation absolutely is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And what we measure is the effect of it, but not the actual inflation itself, which is an increase in the money supply. Now, money supply, we can debate differences on definition there, but I definitely come down on the Bitcoiner side on that one. And then the third one, the whole notion that money can only be what a government says it is, to me, it just ignores thousands of years of human history, and even recent history. Lynn Alden's book, Broken Money, has a great example that I wasn't completely aware of because I'm not a gamer, about the spontaneous creation of the concept of money inside video games, that people start and basically not controlled by the game designers, that spontaneously communities start trading something as money. And I don't remember the name of the game that she identified, but I thought it was such an interesting example because it's so recent. How does someone who believes that money can only be what a government says it is explain that in these virtual worlds that spontaneously people start trading certain goods amongst each other as media of exchange, and those evolve as the most used medium of exchange, which we would call money?
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting as well. And so like identifying those fault lines in such like a clear sort of three-part framework. If we double down on the money sort of fault line a little bit, what is money? And sort of the specific argument there seems to be, is it government created, government controlled, or can it, be produced spontaneously? Can it sort of emerge spontaneously, like in the video game that you mentioned? But I think even within the argument of what is money, there could be many fault lines, like many different sides. That's
Sure.
just two, right? And so um, I want to sort of talk a little bit about a different one, or maybe it's not quite a fault line, but that's focused, what you just described is focused on money as a medium of exchange. And of course, that's well, maybe not of course, but I think you and I at least agree, and a lot of people agree, Bitcoiners would agree that medium of exchange is a critical function of money. But a lot of people
Absolutely.
point to others as well, store of value as well as a unit of account. And roughly, I think, I don't know, this might be not exactly right, but I sort of think of them in like sort of a descending order, with like store of value actually being first and most critical, and then medium of exchange, and then unit of account. And maybe that's just sort of the way that I interpret things. But Bitcoin to date has been extremely functional as a store of value. Anyone who's held it for any period of time longer than, a handful of months, or I guess in some cases you could
Well, you
hold
got
it
to go
for a
through a
couple of years.
cycle.
Yeah, exactly. If you hold
Yeah.
it through a cycle, it's been a great store of value for you wherever you are in the world, which is important because in the US, yeah, you might have a little bit of inflation year over year or every 5 or 10 years or whatever, historically over recent history. But in a country like Venezuela, this was what first sort of snapped Bitcoin into place for me, was when I realized that I think it was Andreas Antonopoulos. Actually, I know it was him. He was, speaking, and he was like, it's very hard to explain Bitcoin to Americans, but I don't have to explain it to Venezuelans because, yes,
Right.
Bitcoin is volatile, but their money is volatile like this. And he does like, a volatile line with his hand that's going down and to the right. And then he goes, Bitcoin is volatile like this. And it's a, volatile line that's going up and to the right. And so for people who don't have a place to put the money that they've earned from their job or whatever it is, Bitcoin access worldwide, they don't need to be able to invest in American assets or whatever it might be. It's like this tremendous store of value, really like an unprecedented global, digital store of value. But the medium of exchange sort of story hasn't really played out yet. And some people say, Well, that's because it's going to take some time and further adoption. The price is going to keep rising. And if the price is rising extremely, that's never going to happen in a straight line. So it sort of has to be volatile. But once it flattens out, once there's like, big global mainstream adoption and it sort of gets to a somewhat stable point, at that point, people will start to use it as a medium of exchange because, the price will just be more, people won't want to hold it and hoard it because it's, going to appreciate so much. So what do you make of sort of like the medium of exchange value around Bitcoin to date? And does that store of value kind of fault line come into play between traditional finance and Bitcoiners as well?
See, I don't think money has to be a store of value. That's where I would definitely disagree. I mean, it's nice if it is, but it has to be a medium of exchange. There was a really interesting for it to truly be money. There's a really interesting speech that Nick Szabo made at Bitcoin 2021 where he debated whether liquidity in Bitcoin markets is really a necessary factor for the success of Bitcoin. And he concluded it's not. You have to be able to use it as a medium of exchange, but the notion of having small bid offer premiums and having intermediaries play fast and loose with whether they're really backed one to one with real Bitcoin in something that can move as fast as Bitcoin does is a ridiculous notion. And I agree with them. I don't think you need liquidity. So I'm not talking about liquid markets as in defined by low bid offer spreads. I'm talking about just the ability to exchange it at all, even when you really need it. So
Wait,
that that is
can I ask for
yeah,
clarification? So what exactly do you mean by that? Because I thought we're talking about sort of like Bitcoin, like the medium of exchange is actually the first and foremost function from your perspective. But
correct.
to me,
Yes.
that I'm having trouble reconciling that with we don't need to be able to exchange it for anything.
No, no, we do. You don't need narrow bid offer markets. In other words, he's saying you don't need financialization. He's kind of disagreeing with Trace Mayer going back into early Bitcoin days, his seven network effects. And the sixth of his seven network effects, which is where we are right now, is financialization. And then number seven is a global reserve currency. And Nick is essentially arguing, as am I, we don't need financialization. You don't need all these derivatives, and you don't need all these market makers, and you don't need people going leveraged in Bitcoin. They're going to blow up. They're going to blow themselves up, right? We've seen that so many times. And I hope people learn the lesson the next time around. Don't leverage Bitcoin. It's a disinflationary asset. You come out ahead just by owning it. You don't need to earn yield on it because it has a inflation rate of 1.7 right now, going down to 1.1 as of April. Okay. And so, when CPI is 3 or 4% in the United States, for example, you come out ahead just by owning Bitcoin. And the actual underlying inflation rate, which is the increase of the money supply, is far in excess of 3 or 4%. Right? It's just that right now it's only showing up in it's 3 or 4% consumer price inflation, but a lot of the inflation is showing up as an asset price inflation because of the mechanism, the plumbing through which money enters into the economy. It doesn't go into consumers' hands anymore. It goes into the financial system's hands, which is why the financial system keeps getting richer and richer and richer. And a lot of people are looking at that going, something's wrong here. And yeah, it is. There are skimming mechanisms that have, including Cantillon effects of the first money. People who get the first money get it before its purchasing power is reduced. And as it works its way through the economy, the purchasing power of that new money gets reduced further. So the financial system gets it first. And guess what? The financial system has gotten very large as a percentage of US GDP and, way out of whack with history. Going back, prior to the 1970s, about how big the financial sector was in the United States. We live in a very financialized economy, and this is the debate. Do you need financialization of Bitcoin in order for Bitcoin to become a medium of exchange? And I would argue, no. I'm with Nick. I don't think it's necessary. So you have to be able to use it. Yes, it has to be recognized as a medium of exchange, but that doesn't mean that you need, all this financialization of it in order to make it a medium of exchange. I personally think a lot of that financialization is setting us back. I don't. I think it's great that there are speculators here. There will always need to be speculators. They do provide the liquidity that they do provide. That is a positive. But all that leveraged financialization that they bring, that's a downside. And so that's why I've said, for example, the ETFs are a double-edged sword. But let's get back to the one of the interesting questions you pointed out rightfully, that Bitcoin itself has become money in certain emerging markets. And over the weekend, as part of this big long thread, a gentleman from Nigeria popped up and said, they're experiencing very high inflation, if not hyperinflation in Nigeria right now. The government is trying to force the naira on everybody, which is a central bank digital currency. And what it ended up doing was backfiring because everybody had to learn what electronic money is and how to hold a digital wallet. And once they've educated themselves on it, guess what? Bitcoin adoption went way up in Nigeria because people would rather hold the thing that the government can't manipulate than the thing that the government exclusively controls. And so he's saying, hey, this was a medium of exchange for me, and it absolutely bailed me out. We haven't talked yet, and maybe this is a place for us to go next, of all right, Bitcoin is a medium of exchanges. I believe it is recognized as money. It already is a small r, small c reserve currency. However, it's small relative to the big reserve currencies in the world. So, what is Bitcoin right now? Base layer Bitcoin is useful for high value payments due to the fee structure. And if you're going to use Bitcoin to buy a cup of coffee, you're going to be interacting with a layer 2, which is just a layer above Bitcoin. This is no different than the Fed having base money, which only banks can transact with unless you're using a physical dollar bill, which is a really small percentage of the base money outstanding. And then the banks issue M1 or M2. So that there is no difference. Bitcoin, base layer Bitcoin is the M0 of the Bitcoin system. Lightning Network and other second layer solutions are the M1 or M2 of the Bitcoin system. And you can get essentially zero cost payments through Lightning right now. And this is where the adoption in El Salvador, for example, is happening. It's not base layer Bitcoin. The fee structure has gotten to the point where Bitcoin, when I first got involved with it, I bought all my Christmas presents in 2014 with Bitcoin, and the fees were cheap. It was cheaper payment system. But right now the fees cost more than the cup of coffee you would be using to buy Bitcoin with a cup of coffee for. So it makes no sense. You've got to have a scaling solution, and the layer 2 layer 2s are the scaling solution, and Lightning is to me the most exciting, though it's not the only one.
Yeah, it's funny. You mentioned the Nigeria thing. I wasn't actually aware of that sort of like narrative ongoing, but I know from years ago when I had looked up Bitcoin, I just follow Bitcoin on Google Trends just to kind of keep tabs on that once in a while. I find it like sort of an
Sure.
interesting little metric. And years ago I looked it up, and Nigeria was like far and away like the most they do like the rank by countries or whatever, and Nigeria was like number one by a good amount. And I just out of curiosity looked it up again to see where it's at now. And as you might sort of guess, El Salvador is number one now, but Nigeria is number two by again like
Yeah.
a large margin. And then it's actually like Switzerland and Austria, somewhat ironically like sort of next on the list. But yeah, I think like there's this within the US at least, and even globally, if you're plugged into, for example, like crypto Twitter or something, like yes, I would say crypto is more decentralized than really any other like domain within technology. But even still, there's just like a very US centric focus. And so you don't really hear, I mean, people will point out these narratives going on internationally, but they're not as sort of central as like what's the prevailing, news in the US, like as exhibited by the recent ETF stuff. Like that's all over everyone's front page, obviously.
Right.
Whereas some of these other stories that are pretty interesting are just they can sort of fly a little bit less, a little more under the radar. And it'll be curious to see as Bitcoin, sort of continues its emergence, like how much of that goes and fades with the US versus how much of that sort of comes from international rise, which I think a lot of people agree. I mean, I would certainly say is sort of the internet has sort of made the world more globalized. And so these places that have been sort of out of the money for a long time, people have a better chance of doing interesting things and, building great companies and whatever it might be from anywhere in the world, more so today than, any time before. And the same is true with the US. You don't have to live in, New York or, California anymore. You can grow up in Idaho or Iowa or wherever it might be. And, if you can just have Wi-Fi and a laptop, you can do a whole lot. So it's just gonna be kind of interesting to see how much of this is like an international rise versus domestic. But you brought up the ETF earlier, obviously big news. I guess last week it was. And it's been kind of interesting for me to watch. I'm curious your perspective because like the whole, the especially like Bitcoin maximalists and whatnot, it's always, not your keys, not your crypto,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole like sovereign money, anti-government, anti-financial institutions, everything like that, which I don't go to the extreme lengths on necessarily, but in general I agree. Like I would like I see the value in having my own control of my own money. And I think there's like sort of a trade-off there. It's like custody has its risks, but so does holding have being sovereign with your crypto, having it on a cold wallet or whatever. If you mess up, there's no one to call. Like so there's
Yeah.
I just try to be practical about sort of like the trade-offs. And I know, obviously we'll talk about Custodia Bank and the role you guys are playing here. But with the ETF, it's just curious to me because everyone suddenly is like a cheerleader. And I'm like, well, this is like kind of not really what Bitcoiners have historically been about. Like this is the financial institutions
Correct.
coming in and we're cheering it on.
Financializing it. Yeah.
Yeah, I get that we're cheering it on in the sense of like it's legitimizing and for people who own Bitcoin, it's probably, it seems like a bullish thing for the conversion price to US dollars, which again, these same people claim to be like, well, we don't care what it's worth in US dollars, we just care how much Bitcoin we have and stuff. So it's been like a little bit hypocritical from my perspective and I haven't really
Dissonance.
known
Yeah.
what to make of it. So I'm curious your perspective.
Well, I've been saying since I first published about it in 2018, I've been saying publicly that the ETFs would be a double-edged sword, right? People were begging for the ETFs back then. It was already 5 years after the SEC had received its first ETF applicant for Bitcoin. Back then, when I was publishing it 5 years ago, and I was talking about some of the games that I saw. Remember at the beginning of this conversation, we were talking about just the morass of the back office of Wall Street. There, believe it or not, the Wall Street firms never have an accurate account of who owns what. Never. It doesn't happen. And there's a simple reason why. Because the IT systems are never in sync with each other. And because of that, they have to have fault tolerances built into the system. And there was a really interesting tweet thread that was put out over the weekend by somebody who clearly knew the Wall Street back office ins and outs and talked about the DTC's continuous net settlement system and explained how you can have failures to deliver through the continuous net settlement system, which was designed to basically allow for netting, right? It's not a real-time gross settlement, it's a delayed net settlement system. And that Bitcoin has this continuous net settlement, but it's always on, sorry, not Bitcoin, the DTC has this continuous net settlement system, but it's always on a delay. Okay, what does that mean? It means that the system is never in sync with each other. Like, why do the banks close at night? Why don't we have banks and stock markets and other financial markets open 24/7, 365? Because they needed time to catch their books and records up with each other. But even then, they were never completely in sync with each other. Why? Because back when securities were in paper form, they physically had to move and they couldn't physically move in real time. It would take typically next day. That's the reason why all the banks originally, the big brokerage firms were located down by the New York Stock Exchange. This is the history of how all this stuff evolved. Okay. And we did not have the ability, and actually, if you really step back at a very high level of abstraction here, Lynn Alden makes this point in Broken Money. It's when you actually had international telecom emerge that you could actually have transaction data, the instructions of a transaction could move essentially at the speed of light. Certainly now it can. But the problem is that money was gold and money only moved at the speed of matter. Okay, so then the banking system abstracted that away and said, well, let's have an IOU for the gold. And that can move as data at the speed of light. But it's that settlement mismatch between transaction data moving at the speed of light and money still moving at the speed of matter. Now, money hasn't been gold since 1971, but what's happened is that we are still in the US stuck with that legacy of T plus. When I started in the brokerage business in 1994, we were at T plus 5 days to settle a stock trade. And the biggest reason, we were not using paper stock certificates by then. Why was it still 5 days? Because it still took a couple of days to settle the US dollar leg. Well, now the Fed just introduced Fed Now, so there's a possibility that we can actually speed up settlement. The SEC has told the brokerage firms, you got to go from T plus 2 days to T plus 1 day beginning in May of this year. But still, the question becomes, why are we not at T plus 10 minutes like Bitcoin? We certainly have the ability to do that kind of settlement, that speed of settlement. And a Fed Now transaction is now 24/7, 365. It's not quite real-time gross settlement because it's not gross. You can actually have netting. The Fed itself will do the netting. But you see where I'm going. Like, as we look down the road, and this is maybe to bring this segment to a conclusion, Lynn Alden is great at thinking about things because she's an engineer. And she said, look, there are two basic, we were talking about these three fault lines earlier. There are two basic monies that have been used in human history. Commodity monies like gold or cattle or wampum, something physical. And then credit monies, which is basically just ledger money. It's IOUs that were written on somebody's ledger. So you either historically have tended to be in one camp or the other. What she concludes is that because of telecommunications, we've been able to create faster transaction data, but we still haven't solved that money leg. And her punchline is she proposes a unified theory of money, which is all money is digital ledger money, and we need a ledger that can be continually updated transparently and globally, which no one controls, and that is Bitcoin. And that is why she thinks Bitcoin is so significant. She's not an ideologue. From her perspective, she's bringing an engineer's perspective, which is we finally have the ability to move the actual money, not just some stroke of the pen that some government controls or central bank controls. This is decentralized money that no one actually controls. And that can move at the speed of light now. That's the game changer. Now we can move transaction data at the speed of light, and we can move the money at the speed of light because of Bitcoin. And that money, she had a really profound text, a tweet that a lot of people commented on, that what's happened in the last few decades since the US went off the tether of the gold standard, and all that was a tether on credit growth. That's it. There was nothing magical about gold per se. It just tethered the amount of money the US government could issue. And once we broke that tether and there was just an infinite amount of money that could be issued, then what? And she concedes that this is the only time in human history where the worse money has crowded out the better money. And because gold clearly has been money throughout millennia, and yet why is it that these stroke of the pen monies, these central bank ledger monies, why is it that they crowded out gold? And the answer is because of how fast transaction data could move. It could move at the speed of light. And therefore, because the settlement mismatch was so extreme of having to move the gold at the speed of matter, and it was very slow, versus moving the data at the speed of light, that is the one reason why for the last 5 decades we've had the worse money crowding out the better money. And her thesis, and I think she's going to be proven right, is that we're going to reverse that because of Bitcoin. It's going to be reversing the reversing the 5 decades of the worse money crowding out the better money. And the weird thing is, as I thought about that profound statement over the weekend, the economics field got corrupted by that. The fact that the worse money was crowding out the better money, because a lot of folks looked at it and objectively said, people want dollars, not gold anymore, because dollars can, it's central bank ledger money. It can move faster. And they don't want the gold coins. It's a minority of the population that want the gold coins right now. Look at the gold market compared to the total amount of US dollar credit. US dollar credit is outstanding is over $100 trillion, right? The gold market is a fraction of that. So that tells you people want dollars, not gold right now. Why? Because dollars can move faster, even though they're constantly getting diluted. But I think her theory is right that because of Bitcoin, we now have the ability as a species, the human race, to go back to what money was before fiat money corrupted the definition of it. And I think she's right. And that is profound. Stop and think about that. I hope I've done her theory justice.
Yeah, that's a fascinating observation, and I definitely need to sit with that for a little bit. But it strikes me basically as being she didn't look for a reason to justify being optimistic about the future of Bitcoin. She looked for why has what's happened to money and how can it be fixed and what is the optimal solution, and arrived at a formula which is basically what Bitcoin is, in a sense, which I think
Correct.
is a very interesting way that most people I don't know how she originally sort of like got interested in Bitcoin, and so maybe she sort of like met the two ends in the middle or something like that. But regardless, it's a very interesting thesis. So playing that
She's an
out,
engineer. So, but just one quick thing.
yeah,
She's
go
an
ahead.
engineer. So she came at this from the perspective of engineering. And Michael Saylor, same thing. They don't think the way finance people or lawyers think. And I'm super interested in the way they think because they're scientists. They're objective. They live in the real world of constraints of physics and math. Whereas what has increasingly happened is that finance people have lived in the world of central bank, let's just create money with the stroke of a proverbial pen and bail people out whenever they need it, bail their friends out, right? The big banks specifically. Yeah, sorry, go
Right.
ahead.
Right. So let's play it out a little bit. You mentioned sort of like this reversal basically of the last 50 years going away from gold and now coming back basically to digital gold, to Bitcoin. I mentioned earlier, if people who don't have sort of faith in the current system think it's broken and sort of doomed to fail, um, it's hard to really put a timeline on some of these things like this. If there is a reversal, if there is this transition, let's look at the
Sure.
last one. Let's say, it's been ongoing for 5 decades from sort of gold to dollars. And
Yep.
is this, the world is changing faster than ever, right? Like hundreds or thousands of years ago, especially thousands, tens of thousands of years ago, whatever it was, um, you could have generations of people, your life, you knew what it was going to be like at the end of it, or you knew what the world was going to be like at the end of your life at the beginning, because it was going to
Yep.
be just like your grandparents' life and just like their
Correct.
grandparents' life.
You
And the
weren't
further you,
mobile and yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
So the further back you go, the more that this is true. And now it's like, I honestly don't really know what to expect for 2030, 6 years away, let alone 2040, 2050,
yeah,
2060. So it's hard to say, like, if you have something that's broken, is this still going to break at a sort of like, okay, so the last 50 years, like granted, things have been moving very fast relatively for the last 50 years as
yeah,
well, versus, 500 or 1,000 years ago. But it's hard to know, like, how fast are things moving now? And like, does the financial system, is it going to move that fast? Because like Bitcoin's 15 years old. And
hmm,
that's like not a super short, like
correct.
digital period of time. That's like a real period of time, 15 years. And it's not like it's
Yep,
global world reserve currency or anything. It's like $1 trillion market cap or something like that. Like it's big and
correct.
it's been
Yeah,
growing very fast, but it hasn't been like instant. So do you foresee this, quote unquote reversal playing out over, years or decades or, several
yeah,
decades? Like how do you see the timing of that? And then I think a good way to sort of bring Custodia and what you're doing into the conversation is like you did have to make a decision, like when you're starting a business, especially a bank. You're not going to just like sort of do that on a whim for like a couple of year mission. Like you have a long-term
yeah.
vision there as to how it fits in the picture. So maybe you can speak to that as well.
Yeah, well, and it's related because if I thought that the U.S. dollar system was going to collapse tomorrow, then I wouldn't have started a bank for U.S. dollars, right? Why bother? To your point, and it actually does take longer to start a bank than even I anticipated. Now, granted, we've had a lot of curveballs thrown at us, but yeah, eventually it will all come out just how many curveballs we've had thrown at us, and we're a survivor, and that's great. And I salute the folks who are along this, along with Custodia in this journey, precisely because it has been a winding road, unanticipatedly, and literally illegally. But I'll set that aside. The to get back to, yeah, what's the transition period? And it gets to Lynn's book as well, which I highly recommend. It's going to take time, and if I thought it wasn't going to take time, then I would have done what a lot of hardcore Bitcoiners did and started a Bitcoin only business. But actually, right now, I think the most important thing that I could do to help the ecosystem develop is help it make sure that it maintains its US dollar connectivity. And so that's why I've put my time and efforts into this. And look at how hard they're fighting us. And it's a really interesting question because some of the biggest banks are banking the big exchanges. Just came out this morning. We're recording this on Tuesday. Howard Lutnick of Cantor Fitzgerald announced at Davos that Cantor Fitzgerald has been holding the T-bills for Tether all along. That had been rumored, but had never been, to my knowledge, publicly confirmed until today. Okay, so wow, there's a double standard, right? Look at the small banks and crypto native companies like ourselves trying to break in, and look at the big institutions that have been allowed to do the things that the regulators have prohibited the startups from doing. And they say that it's illegal for the startups to do those things, and then look at the big banks doing exactly those things, big institutions doing exactly those things. So I'm with you. I don't cheer this. I look at it and say, okay, wow, there is an incredible double standard among the regulators here. And I'll leave it at that. I don't want to say more. But now to your question of how does this play out? Safety Namus and I probably 2-3 years ago had a debate on, is it a sudden collapse or is it a gradual, people just vote with their feet? And we saw that with Uber. It's a really good example of, the incumbent taxi and limousine commissions and taxi medallion owners were fighting Uber tooth and nail, and then ended up joining them. And it was a winding path. It wasn't just a one-time, flip over, right? And there were a lot of fights in a lot of places. But at the end of the day, the taxis, for the most part, they found, equilibrium with Uber, and a lot of taxi drivers are Uber drivers. And now they can be flagged down on the street if they're not, currently becoming an Uber or Lyft, on the way to an Uber or Lyft drive. Or they can just turn their light off because they're on their way to an Uber or Lyft drive. Like that's the kind of stuff that's happening. And it will happen with finance as well. And people will just vote with their feet, and they will use both systems. And I think that's already happening to a small degree today. To your point, it's especially true in emerging markets. And Americans can't conceive, and a lot of people in developed countries can't conceive of that either. They just can't conceive of not having, readily available banking services. They just can't. And so to Americans, it's a speculative asset or it's digital gold. But to folks like this gentleman who spoke up from Nigeria, it's a lifeline.
Yeah, so last question here. You've helped sort of move forward. You mentioned the double standard on regulation, and it's just been, I think, more than anything, it's just been the lack of clarity that's been problematic, or at least that's what a lot of people trying to build companies and whatnot in crypto have been sort of pointing to. It's like we'll sort of accept a broad range of different kinds of rules here, but we just need some rules,
Yeah.
not just regulation by enforcement, basically. And so you've been critical in sort of helping some productive regulation sort of come through in
Yep.
Wyoming, which is, you mentioned at the beginning where you grew up and then lived for a while on the East Coast and moved back to Wyoming post your sort of TradFi career, I think, more recently as you're, building Custodian and everything. And so can you talk a little bit about some of the more fundamental work that you've done there, or some of the sort of actions that you're more proud of and that you think can be maybe modeled after by other US states or even potentially federally?
Well, everyone should be watching what we're doing and the litigation that we have. I can just talk about the fact of the litigation because it does impact the states, and I can't say more than that. The docket is public. A lot got made public right before Christmas. It hasn't really been talked about. But it is publicly available for anyone who wants to go research it. The dates are also public. Custodia filed for summary judgment on December 20th. It was unsealed on December 22nd. And the summary judgment motions will be fully briefed, I believe, from memory, February 23rd. And if it does go to trial, the trial date is scheduled to begin April 8th. That is all public information. So that gives you a sense of where things stand with that. But look, I think a lot of what Wyoming did is replicable in other states. It's already been copied in a number of states. Wyoming did some really foundational, boring but important stuff. Defined digital assets as property. If it's stolen, then that means it's theft. It defined digital assets under commercial law. Well, that means financial institutions know how to transact with it and know what their rights and obligations are. And it also means that if there is a dispute that ends up in the court system, that a judge has a roadmap for determining the rights and obligations of the parties. And it doesn't end up basically being something where judges have to make it up because there's no statutory guidance. Those kinds of things are really foundational, critical importance. And I think the special purpose depository institutions are also really important. There are 4 states that have chartered uninsured banks, not FDIC insured banks. And the reason why that is important, this goes back to 2017 in Wyoming. Wyoming knew that the Operation Choke Point 1.0, which was done under the current FDIC chair, Marty Grunberg, he is FDIC chair again and has undertaken Operation Choke Point 2.0. Same person, 2 different operations to turn the screws behind the scenes on the banking industry, on industries that are not politically correct. So one of the things that the states have done, there are 4 states that have chartered uninsured banks that are not subject to FDIC jurisdiction. And at the moment, the Fed is blocking all of them. It is very interesting. Those states are an eclectic mix of states, 2 red, 2 blue. Wyoming, we know, and Idaho, and then Vermont and Connecticut. And one of the Connecticut banks, interestingly, was formed. The Connecticut Uninsured Bank was that has applied for a Fed Master Account was formed by the recently retired vice chair of supervision at the Fed itself. So obviously he doesn't think that it's a problem to have an uninsured state charter bank because he chose to form one and apply for a Fed Master Account. So how this all transpires, we'll see. But you start to see how this is important. And all of those things they have been copied. These other states that have uninsured banks, those particular banks don't have anything to do with digital assets. But the whole question over whether the states are subordinate to the Federal Reserve in the banking system, that has never been true, and it will be determined by the courts. And I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Caitlin. I know we're up on time, but I really appreciate you taking the time. It's been a fascinating conversation. Where can people go to follow along with you and what you're doing in the future?
Yeah, definitely most often posting on Twitter at Caitlin Long _. Watch out for lots of imposters. And then also on LinkedIn, and then at Custodia Bank on both Twitter and LinkedIn, and custodiabank.com for our website. Check us out.